It's been a while since I made a video, but I have a really great excuse for that. I'm working on a bigger project to understand the coming tumultuous situation throughout the 2020s, how society is going to be changing because we're at a point of transition. So during that process, I read 4 different books that I think most accurately depict the type of transition that we're going through and what's going to unfold over the next decade. While I am a little bit delayed on that big project that has to do with the parallel economy, I'm spending a lot of time on it, so that is coming. Sorry for the delay. I wanted to make sure I got it right. But in the meantime, I wanted to make a video explaining these 4 books that help me understand where we're at and where we're going. And like I said, they all talk about these different cycles. So the first book is called The Sovereign Individual: Mastering the Transition to the Information Age. Now, this book is a little bit older. It was written in the late 90s as we were transitioning into the new millennium. You know, what's going to happen in the new age of information sort of thing. These authors predicted some pretty big transitions that occurred in this shift from the industrial era into the age of information. Now, what this corresponds to is these 500-year cycles. This book takes a very broad look and looks at 500-year cycles that the world goes through that are easy to trace at least back through the dawn of this age when Jesus was born, what our calendar, the Gregorian calendar, is based on. So you had a 500-year period up to the year 500 where Rome was the big empire. You had the collapse of Rome around the year 500. You had around the year 1000 some new inventions that brought us out of the Dark Ages and into the medieval times, even though those medieval times were a lot darker for a lot of people compared to the Dark Ages. Then you had the Renaissance around 1500, which shifted power from the church to industry. And it also gave rise to the nation state, and now we're shifting. Another 500-year period has passed, and we're shifting out of the industrial age, which the nation state was very at home in, and into the age of information, which changes the dynamic once again, where individuals have more power. What's interesting is that this is a culmination of not just a 500-year cycle, but also only 4 major cycles throughout humanity. So we started with hunter-gatherer, and then we moved into a farming society. And that transition took thousands of years. And then that farming society lasted for thousands of years. Then when we transitioned to an industrial society around the year 1500, starting then over the course of hundreds of years, that time frame got a lot smaller. Hunter-gatherer to farmer, thousands of years. Farmer to industrialist, hundreds of years. And now we're going from industrial society to information society, and that promises to be an even shorter time frame. So we're looking at a classic 500-year transition, and this is only going to be the 3rd major transition in human history about what type of society we're living in. And so these 2 events happening simultaneously promise to bring the most tumultuous years in human history. But that doesn't necessarily mean the most violent, it doesn't necessarily mean the worst, but you do have to be prepared. Because there's going to be a lot of dangers and there's going to be a lot of people left behind, but there's also going to be massive opportunities. This book basically predicts individuals are going to have a lot more power, and that's because of computers, computing power, the laptop right in their hands with the phone, and because of things like cryptocurrency and encryption in general. It changes the dynamic of whether it's beneficial to have massive amounts of power or not. The nation state with large armies was able to take resources from other countries. They had a return on violence. Violence got them material goods. And that is not going to be as easy to do in the information age. It's going to be easy to protect yourself and to protect your wealth. We'll see probably more small-scale violence and less large-scale violence, and what that is likely to lead to is a breakdown of massive institutions like the nation state and into smaller political organizations, city-states, individual countries that have a unique culture. So basically, the nation-state's power is going to fade away like the church's power during the Renaissance, where the church had this stranglehold on medieval society. They invented chivalry to try to temper the knight's violence, And they did a lot of good in the beginning of this 500-year phase from the year 1000 through 1500. The church had the monasteries. They passed information along. They perfected farming practices. They brewed mead and beer, which is important. They copied books down, but then they just became more bureaucratic and more burdensome as the years went on. They dominated society. They stopped helping innovate, and they started holding innovation back. So then when the printing press was invented, along with the gunpowder revolution, when small arms came into force, that sort of negated the power of the knights, and it negated the power of the church to hold on to that information. People realized, maybe I can improve my life. Maybe I don't have to wait for the next life to accumulate some wealth, make investments that are returning more than just giving all my money to the church. Thus led to the industrial age. And like I said, in the industrial age, that nation state was poised to protect that vast wealth that people are creating and to take that wealth, which is why we've seen empires in very large countries, very large nation states, as opposed to just nations, which are a group of people that have a culture in common, nation states, which group multiple different nations and cultures together to form this large institution of power. But again, like the church, that's becoming untenable. It's large, it's clunky, it's oppressing people, and people won't put up with that forever. Now, around the year 1500, though, nobody would have thought that the church was going to collapse and just go away. And of course, it didn't happen that quickly. Remember, though, what I was talking about with these transitions. They're accelerating. So now in the span of one human lifetime, we could see the power of the nation state fade to the degree that it took hundreds of years after 1500 for the church to go from overbearing dictator of basically all of Europe to religion in the background that didn't really have that much power. Nobody would have predicted it at the time. People might have thought this is going to go on for another thousands of years. They're just going to keep concentrating power, but that didn't happen. The future was not like the past, and that's another important point I'll get back to. But let me first talk about the second book, which is The Fourth Turning in American Prophecy. This one was also written in the 90s, and it was also sort of like a 2000 New Millennium transition book, but this one zooms in a lot, and it talks about 80-year generational cycles. Social cycles that different generations of the United States have gone through. Since the nation's founding at the Revolutionary War, that was the first phase of crisis, and something brand new and very different from any governments that had emerged before came after that. The next 80-year cycle ended with the Civil War, and there was a lot of growth after the Civil War in terms of industrial. The next cycle ended around World War II. Again, lots of growth afterwards after this crisis. And now we're in another period of crisis that promises to shift the way America looks, the power structure, and what type of new order emerges after this transition. And this one is based on 20-year generations that have a certain personality. They behave in a particular way based on the events that were happening while they were growing up. So people that grow up in a crisis period are going to respond differently to the world compared to people who grow up during a period of growth. I do have a more in-depth video about the fourth turning, so I'll link to that if you want to learn more. But basically, it's a really interesting look at the social dynamics during this fourth turning, this period of crisis, and how a new order is going to emerge from this. The storm before the calm, America's discord, the coming crisis of the 2020s, and the triumph beyond. This one is a much more recent book, and it's about what's happening now. This one it still talks about that 80-year cycle, generational social cycle from the fourth turning, but it also brings in a 50-year economic cycle, which happens to be simultaneously lining up with this fourth turning. So this book dives into a little bit more of what's happening politically. And he makes the case that the political system that we see right now, this two-party system, the left and the right, the Democrats and the Republicans, and who has been part of those coalitions, that is going to completely change. For example, working class Americans used to be basically Democrats because it was a labor union type thing. Those aren't the same Democrats from today. Those people have been transitioning more to, you could say, to the right, to the Republican. They were big Trump supporters. And the reason is that Trump said, you're right, things aren't fair, you are being left behind. And the Democrats have tried to do this for a long time, for example, with the black vote. Democrats have considered black people their voters for a very long time. They get very angry when black people don't vote for Democrats. The storm before the calm is making the case that that voting bloc that's classic among Democrats, black people, other minorities, maybe even Hispanics, and then this working class bloc, which is really pissed off and went largely for Trump, they're probably going to form a coalition of power because they actually have a lot of interests in common. No, the working class is not all racist, and most black people don't believe all this woke crap that the left likes to push and all this social justice warrior stuff. What they care about is their neighborhoods, their jobs, their livelihood. Are their children going to be better off than they were? And that's why these people will probably form a very powerful political coalition that's not going to look like Democrats, it's not going to look like Republicans. Because right now, we're living in a technocracy. And we've been living in this technocracy since World War II. This is trust the experts. It's coming, again, this is coming to a head right now. The ultimate technocracy has been these pandemic controls over the last 2 years. And what's interesting is that this book was actually written before the pandemic. So it's basically, that's what's great about a lot of these books, is that a lot of their predictions have basically come true. A lot of their points have been strengthened by things that have happened since they were released. So the ultimate power of the technocracy was shown throughout the pandemic. Trust the experts. No, you can't think for yourself. Trust the scientists. No, not that scientist. The scientist with the right credentials, the scientist that went to the right school, the scientist who has the political connections, the one that the media trusts, the experts in the media, the fact checkers. All of this technocracy is coming to an end. And again, that's going to be hard to believe for a lot of people because they're looking at this right now and they're like, the technocrats are more powerful than ever. They managed to shut down society. They managed to lock people in their homes without due process. Now there's a bunch of public health dictators. They're just issuing dictates, orders. They're not going through Congress. They're not going through the political system. They're reaching for more power than ever. How could I possibly think that that is going to fade away? It's only going to get worse. But again, as we're looking at these cycles, a lot of times when that happens, it's actually the end of a cycle. It's like they're a desperate animal fighting their one last fight, desperately trying to grasp onto the power that they've held for so long. But it's coming to an end. It's coming to an end. There's nothing that they can do about it. So they're lashing out. They're one last big try to hold on to that power. But the technocracy is going to fall because nobody trusts these major institutions. Nobody trusts the politics, the media, the pharmaceutical companies. Nobody trusts them. And when you have nobody trusting them, in this entire technocracy is based on trusting the experts, that falls and a new order emerges. Then we get into a brand new book by Ray Dalio, who's a billionaire. He runs the biggest hedge fund in the world. He's self-made, didn't inherit his money, very intelligent guy, understands markets, understands economics, and that's what Principles for Dealing with a Changing World Order, Why Nations Succeed and Fail. It takes a very economic look at things, especially that 50-year cycle, and what he's saying is that the debt cycle is coming to an end. There is more debt than ever, not just in the United States, not just among individuals, but in every major government on earth is in so much debt. Corporations are in a lot of debt, and anybody holding those debt assets is going to be left holding the bag. Essentially, over the last 50-year economic cycle, since the dollar was taken off of the gold reserve, everything's been based on debt, and you can make money in debt. The US government takes on debt, the Federal Reserve takes on debt, investing in bonds is investing in debt. Even investing in the stock market when the Federal Reserve is printing new dollars and buying stocks with those dollars, that is essentially a debt-fueled bubble. A lot of all the 2008 mortgage crisis, that was investing in debt, investing in bad debt. And what he's saying is at the end of this 50-year big debt cycle, the people who are still expecting to make money in debt are going to be in for a rude awakening. Bonds. Yes, the US government has always paid their debts before, but there is no guarantee that they will be able to do that moving forward. In fact, when you look at the numbers, it seems almost impossible that they'll be able to pay their debts moving forward, which makes it rather insane to get a 30-year bond or even a 10-year bond when you just see what types of bills are coming due. And this is the thing. Everybody always thinks the future is going to look just like the past. But that is not true. Whenever you look at one of these periods of transitions, the future did not look like the past. But what happens because of these 80-year cycles is basically people forget within the span of one human lifetime, everything changes. So it was very hard to convince somebody that grew up during the Great Depression to go into debt to buy stocks or to buy debt assets or to even keep their money in a bank. A coffee can to them seemed a lot safer because of what they went through. But that was 80 plus years ago. So that has largely been forgotten by people that are in the markets right now. So if you could distill Dalio's main point down to one sentence, it is just because the past looked that way does not mean the future will look that way. And that is especially true at the end of these cycles. Again, all these books are talking about large and small cycles that are coming to a head in the 2020s and are promising to make it very tumultuous, but also to give you a lot of opportunity. And that is one of Ray Dalio's points. You have to diversify. I mean, when you see a superpower fading like the United States and a superpower rising like China, it makes sense to hedge your bets. Don't have all of your bets in the United States, because that could end very poorly for the fading nation. He also talks about the likelihood of going to war and how that's happened in a lot of these types of transitions before, when you see one superpower rising and one superpower falling. Diversify. Don't have everything in crypto, but crypto could be very promising, especially given the other books that I've been talking about and the promises of this information age and what's going to happen to free us from the nation state. I think cryptocurrency, encryption, technology obviously are going to be huge. So definitely have your hands in a bit of that. But also don't think that gold and silver is dead just because it hasn't done much for a while. For 5,000 years, they've held their value. People have kept going back to them in times of crisis, and that's probably going to happen again. Property, foreign stocks, different types of assets, businesses. What types of businesses are going to be extremely in demand over the next 10 years? What types of businesses are going to make you rich because people really need them right now or are going to need them in the coming years? That's an important thing to think about. That's what the project I'm working on has been all about. That's why I'm reading these books. This is a parallel economy project. It's trying to build the new institutions, the new structures that are going to help a lot of people transition during this time, but also make those people providing these services and goods, these really important foundational structures to society, it's going to make those people rich. So you might want to subscribe, because a lot more information is going to be coming your way on that. Now, like I said, put all these 4 books together and you start to get a picture of what's going to happen. They're all talking about transition periods to new ages, to new orders, to new organizations of society and power structures. And what we're seeing is that they're all culminating in the same decade. We have this large, broadest cycle of just human phases: hunter-gatherer, farmer, industrialist, information age. That's happening right now. We have this 500-year cycle that transitions to a new age. That's happening right now. We have this 80-year cycle which culminates in a crisis. That's happening right now. And we have a 50-year cycle of economics, which is basically a debt cycle, and at the end of it, some major changes happen in how people earn money, how people invest, and what this economic structure happens. That's happening right now. So we have all these cycles coming to a head at one point, which promises to be a really major transition. With the sovereign individual mastering the transition to the information age, which is talking about the death of the nation state and the birth of a new information age where individuals will be more powerful than they've been since the collapse of Rome, essentially. That's pretty exciting. The 4th turning, 80-year cycles. We're also coming up on something new. Things are not going to look exactly like they have been. Same with politics, the storm before the calm. We're not going to be stuck with this same crap political 2-party system. I mean, if we look at the sovereign individual, we might not even be stuck with a political system over the entire United States at all. And the economic cycle. Things are not going to look like they've looked over the last 50 years. So if you're doing the exact same things that worked over the last 50 years, you might want to take a step back and think about that do a little bit of diversifying and think about what's going to be very valuable in the coming 50-year cycle. What's that going to look like? Not a debt-based cycle, because we're about to go through something probably that's going to make the Great Depression look like a fun weekend in Disneyland. And finally, a bonus book. Because all these things are very destabilizing. I'm talking about political changes in the United States. We're talking about nation states perhaps not even existing anymore. And so for this bonus book, this is one I read a couple of years ago, but it was really interesting. And I think it can provide some historical context about what those fault lines might look like in the United States if this shakeup does cause the United States government to shake at its core, change, maybe even stop existing. And again, just because it seems like that's absurd because they're more powerful than ever, what we've been talking about through this entire video is that just when things seem like they couldn't get any worse, a lot of times that's the time where that institution either collapses or rapidly devolves or changes and a new power structure emerges. Where these nations still stand that are not the United States nation, it's not the American nation, it is smaller regional nations that have cultural similarities and that have been there since the birth of the United States, and that's where a lot of the political fault lines still lie, and those could come alive again and be more pronounced than ever if, again, as all these other books predict, there's going to be different vectors of power. It's probably going to be on a smaller scale. Remember what I was talking about with the return on violence with the nation state. And if it is on the smaller scale, if they do break down into smaller governments, reading American Nations, A History of the 11 Rival Regional Cultures of North America could provide you a lot of info about where those political and perhaps even geographical fault lines will lie, what these nations, which nations will come together because they have things in common, and form new political organizations. The maps that you see in this book could look a lot like the maps that we see after this major transition of the 2020s. Now, I have a lot more to say about how you can properly prepare yourself to not just survive, but thrive during this time. Remember, there's going to be a lot of people that are left out, left behind. You don't have to be one of them. And in fact, the way that you can make sure that you thrive in this coming era is by providing help to the people that need it. That's what businesses are all about. Providing goods and services that are in demand, that people need. And the businesses that give people the most, the biggest benefit, those ones are going to do the best. So looking ahead for this tumultuous transition, there's going to be a lot of people that were depending on collapsing institutions with the nation state and with other government structures and with economic structures that had their retirement tied up in debt assets that are going to collapse, or the US government that trusted higher education to provide them skills to get a job. All of these people are going to need to transition to this new age of information. And if you have a business that helps them transition with the goods and services they need to not depend on those collapsing institutions, you're going to do very well for yourself. So subscribe, because that's coming your way. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your time. I appreciate you watching. I'm Joe Jarvis. Come back and see me again soon.